A body can hang longer than a dog can breathe. The storm came in sideways across Pine Hollow, hard enough to make the rust tin roof shudder on its bolts and sing in tired, ugly notes. Every gust found a seam. Every seam answered. Snow dust hissed through gaps in the warped siding and skated over the floor in thin white snakes before dying on patches of black ice that had formed under the rafters. Chain link shifted and scraped overhead, a bright, metallic sound that didn't belong in a forest this still. Harper hung with her boots a foot off the concrete, head sagging, uniform jacket split open at the zipper where Silas had started his work. Beside her, the Malinois twisted once, muscles jumping under a dark coat, gone stiff with meltwater and blood. Titan tried to bark and got only a strangled, wet rasp for the effort. The sound hit the beams, bounced, and came back smaller. Rafe stood near the half-open side door with a collar turned up against the cold, chewing nicotine gum that had long since lost its flavor. He kept glancing out at the white dark beyond the threshold, one hand on the suppressed pistol at his chest, the other turning a snow knife the way nervous men worked prayer beads. Silas ignored the weather, the dog, and the woman's face. He gave his attention to the job because the job was what mattered. He moved in close. He was close enough for Harper to smell the clean oil on his gloves and the faint chemical bite of the blade he had wiped down before using. He operated with no rage and no pleasure, only process. He slid the dagger under the first layer of her coat and drew it down in a slow, careful line, parting fabric without touching skin, then peeled the insulation back with 2 fingers and checked the seams, the lining, and the hidden folds where panicked people like to stuff things they thought would save them. Harper's mouth opened around a breath that would not come all the way in. Her lips had gone the ugly pale of freezer-burned meat. One hand kept twitching toward her empty holster from pure muscle memory, even now, even half gone from lack of air. Silas noticed it and said nothing. He moved to the next layer. The chain above her tightened when she kicked, links grinding over steel with a sound like a ratchet under load. Titan answered with another broken whine and a violent snap of his jaws at empty air. There was a groove worn into the fur and skin around the dog's neck where the metal pressed in. Each time the animal fought, the groove darkened. Rafe looked over once, jaw working the gum. "You think she stashed it in the truck?" he asked. Snow flashed white in the doorway behind him, then vanished again. Silas checked the inside pocket, then the body cam mount, then the stab-resistant panel under her shirt. He did it like a man auditing spoiled inventory. Harper tried to lift her head and managed only enough to stare at him through watering eyes. He saw the defiance there. He also saw calculation. That interested him more. People near death either collapsed inward or started counting exits. She was still counting. His knife traced the hem of her undershirt. Silas's jaw tightened as he watched her reaction, his eyes narrowing to catch any micro-expression that might betray her. He pressed a thumb into the side of her tactical belt, felt for bulk, then crouched to inspect one boot, then the other. Not because he knew where the drive was, but because method beat guessing. Outside, the wind slammed the wall hard enough to shake down flakes of rust and old insulation. Inside, all he could hear was the dog choking itself raw and the slow drag of Harper trying to fill lungs that the chain would not let her use. The room smelled of oxidized metal, wet wool, old oil, and that hot copper reek of blood, meeting air too cold to keep it liquid. Rafe shifted his weight, knife still turning in his hand. "Clock's moving," he said. Boss wanted the handoff clean. Silas rose without hurry, eyes on Harper, watching her swallow against pressure, watching her fail. He had seen this part before. The body always tried to save itself first. Secrets came after. Usually, Titan kicked again, claws scratching uselessly against open space, and one hind paw clipped her shoulder on the way down. Silas finally straightened, exhaled through his nose, and wiped the blade once on the inside of Harper's torn jacket, where no one would see the smear until too late. Then he looked at Rafe, and the annoyance on his face was as flat as paperwork under fluorescent light. "It's not here." "Did you check her trunk, Rafe? Boss is gonna skin us all if we don't find that drive." He said it in the same tone a tired foreman might use over missing inventory. It was not louder than the storm, and it didn't need to be. Harper's eyes sharpened for one dangerous second at the words, "the drive." And that told him more than any scream would have. There it was, confirmation. The drive was real. The drive mattered. The drive was close enough to make her hang on to consciousness by her fingernails. Rafe spat his gum into a gloved palm, shoved it into a pocket, and pushed away from the door. "I checked the cab, not the trunk," he said. "Wasn't exactly expecting a traffic stop to turn into this." He tipped his head toward Titan. "What about the mutt?" Silas glanced once at the dog, at the red gums showing under the chain, at the eyes going glassy. "The dog's leverage," he said. "The woman's the lock." Then he stepped back in toward Harper, with the knife low, and his free hand reaching for her boot, while the chain above them creaked. The storm hammered the roof, and the seconds on her face kept burning down, where anyone with a little training could have seen them. Elias Vance watched the warehouse through thermal glass and let the world turn into numbers. The lenses painted the storm in dead colors. The cold wash flattened into blue-black static, framing the hard shapes of pine trunks and the bent spine of the building. Heat was the only honest thing in view. It leaked where the warped tin failed to hold it. It pulsed under skin. It thinned when blood stopped moving the way it should. He stood inside the tree line with one shoulder against a rough trunk. Carhartt, stiff at the elbows, breath slipping out of him in small, controlled bursts that frosted and vanished before the wind could grab them. Under his boots, the slope was packed down to black ice where old melt had frozen hard. He felt the slickness through the soles and adjusted without looking, weight settling forward, knees unlocked, one gloved hand steady on the optics. Somewhere below, hidden from his naked eye by the angle and the storm, chain struck steel again. It was a high, thin ring. Then a muffled choke followed that made the muscles along his neck tighten before his mind caught up. He did not move, not yet. Movement came after the picture held, still long enough to read. Inside the warehouse, 4 signatures burned against the cold. 2 stood out bright and steady, upright, active, moving with the calm economy of men who believed they controlled the room. 2 more were wrong. One long human shape swung in a narrowing band of heat, hot only at the center now, limbs cooling toward blue-gray. Beside it, the dog was a broken flare. Its neck was too hot from abrasion and trapped blood. The chest was stuttering, and its extremities were losing ground fast. Through the glass, Elias could even catch the ugly contrast, where fresh blood still held red-white brightness, while exposed skin, starved by cold and pressure, was already washing toward dead color. He noted the door, the side door, and the sightline from the ridge, guessing they used suppressors from the way no panic had spread past the walls. He thumbed the focus wheel and tracked one of the standing men bending toward the suspended woman. It was a search pattern, not an assault. The hands were methodical, looking for a package small enough to hide on a body. The second man drifted near the exit, heat blooming at his jaw every time he worked something in his mouth. It was probably gum, either nicotine or mint, something to keep the nerves from talking too loud. Elias lowered the optics a fraction and checked his own pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist out of habit, an old, ugly reflex from years of triage under worse skies. It was fast, but clean and useful. He should have turned around. That was the simple answer. Walk back up through the pines to the cabin, kill the perimeter alarms, feed the stove, and let the storm bury whatever happened down there by morning. He had lived 5 years on that rule. Stay out of it. Stay off every map that mattered. Let the world chew its own leg off somewhere else. The woman in the warehouse wore a badge under the torn layers, or had once. That alone should have been enough reason to disappear. Cops brought paperwork, questions, faces, and databases. Cartel men brought more cartel men. None of it belonged inside his line. He knew what blood and snow could grow into if you gave it one night and a rumor. Then, the dog made the sound again. It was not a bark and not a howl. It was a compact, crushed noise, dragged through a closing airway. The kind military handlers heard in the last bad seconds when a working animal had given everything it had and the body was failing anyway. Elias felt the old theater light up in him all at once. He remembered heat, iodine, wet canvas, and men talking too calmly over hemorrhage. A shepherd with shrapnel in its flank trying to crawl back to its handler, while rotor wash blew dust into everyone's teeth. The memory came without permission and without color. He shut it down the way he always did, by cutting it into tasks. He evaluated airway, perfusion, time to anoxic injury, and distance to target. The trick was never feeling less. It was giving the feeling a narrower hallway to run through. He brought the optics up one last time and fixed the picture in place. He counted 2 active threats, 1 suspended female trending bad, and 1 K9 trending worse. There were no visible long guns, but there was no reason to assume there weren't blades. The structure was too loud for a rushed entry if he took the wrong side. He felt the wind on the torn edge of one glove and smelled cold pine, old rust, and the faint ozone stink storms sometimes pulled out of the dark before they hit full force. The words lined up in his head the way dosages used to, clipped and exact. 2 hostiles. Light weapons. Human brain dies after 3 minutes without oxygen. Dog dies faster due to tracheal cartilage structure. I have 90 seconds. He let that settle. He had 90 seconds to break the room open before the woman crossed from salvageable to damaged, and less for the dog if the chain kept biting that way. He took one slow, deliberate breath, letting the freezing air fill his lungs to ground himself before the violence. He slid the optics down against his chest and looked at the warehouse with his own eyes now, seeing just a darker shape in darker woods. He wanted no loud shots, no survivors with a clean look at his face, and no scene left for some deputy to read like a confession. He shifted his weight off the trunk, tested the ice once with the edge of a boot, then stepped out from the cover of the pines and started downslope toward the warehouse, while the storm scraped at the trees and the clock in his head began to burn. Rafe pushed through the side door with his shoulder and let it bang once against the warped tin before he caught it and eased it back. The storm hit him full in the face. Fine snow, hard as ground glass, skated across the yard and stung the wet skin around his eyes. He stood under the crooked lip of the roof, chewing the last chemical sweetness out of a strip of nicotine gum, and listened to Pine Hollow try to flay itself alive. Wind moved through the trees in long, ugly breaths. The warehouse answered with shivers and groans. He liked posts that involved movement, noise, a warm engine under him, anything but this. Cold made time stupid. It stretched. It made a man notice things he didn't want to notice, like the shine of black ice under the drifted snow, or the way his trigger finger kept brushing the frame of the suppressed pistol just to reassure itself something solid was still there. Through the wall behind him came the faint scrape of chain on steel and one choked animal, sound cut short so fast it barely counted as sound at all. His jaw tightened around the gum. Silas could take forever when he got methodical, and methodical was what the boss paid for. He thumbed the transmit stud on his radio without lifting it from his chest rig. The check-in should have been simple: a soft click, a low answer. The usual. Instead, the speaker spat a burst of white hiss straight into his sternum, sharp enough that he winced before he could stop himself. He pulled the unit up and frowned at it. For a fraction of a second, maybe less, the hiss thinned, as if something on the line was trying to punch through and getting buried alive under static. Then it came back harder, flattening everything beneath it. The sound had texture, almost grainy, like sand being poured over hot wiring. Rafe hit the button again. Same result. He thought it was weather first, then cheap gear, before the third thought came along and stayed. He turned a slow circle under the overhang, eyes working the tree line, the yard, the slope, and the dark spill of woods beyond the road. Snow swept sideways through his flashlight beam when he clicked it on low, turning the air itself into moving clutter. He saw nothing, noticing no headlights and no shape slipping between trunks. The static kept chewing at his radio. He tucked the useless unit closer to his ear, listening to the tiny delay before each new wave of interference rolled in and crushed the channel dead. It was too regular to be weather and too clean. That was when the boredom left him. He started back toward the door, feeling no sudden panic, just a faster, tighter version of himself. He put his knife away, brought his pistol up, and tucked his shoulders. The training came on like an old machine catching gear. He needed to find cover, re-establish contact, and cut the angle. He had one boot inside the threshold when something metallic snapped out in the dark behind the warehouse. Not loud, not dramatic, just a hard-clipped bite of steel under pressure. Then came another sound that made more sense a heartbeat later, which was the main breaker giving up its teeth. The lights didn't flicker. They died all at once. The weak yellow wash under the rafters vanished so completely it felt physical, like a hood dropping over his head. Darkness flooded the room and turned it solid. For one blind second, he saw only after images burned green against his eyelids. Then, even those were gone. The warehouse became a black lung full of old, cold, and stale rust, and the smell of frightened sweat. Somewhere in that black, a chain swung and struck a beam. Somewhere else, boots shifted on concrete. Rafe froze where he was, pistol high, trying to let his pupils claw open. It didn't matter. There was no light to catch. The dark had weight to it, thick and ink black, swallowing edges, corners, and distance. From deeper inside came the small, controlled rustle of a man moving backward to a defensible corner. It was Silas, which was good. No one shouted. That was the part that turned his guts cold. If this had been a couple of hill punks screwing around with a power line, there would have been noise. Instead, the room tightened down into discipline. Silas gave him nothing verbal, only the scrape of a boot sole angling across concrete, the whisper of fabric against tin, and the almost inaudible shift that said he had found cover and was holding it. Rafe moved 2 steps left, then stopped when his heel slid on hidden ice tracked in from outside. It was a tiny mistake with a tiny sound, but it was big enough. He settled his weight, muzzle cutting the dark, and listened past the static still bleeding weakly from his radio. The woman hanging somewhere in front of him had gone quiet in the wrong way. The dog hadn't. It made one raw, compressed noise from high in its throat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Rafe tried to map the door, the beam, the hanging chain, the work table, and the blind lane along the outer wall in his head, but he found pieces missing. He knew the layout 10 minutes ago. Now it felt rearranged, as if the dark itself had moved things when the lights went out. Outside, the storm hammered the roof again. Inside, the silence between those hits turned awful. He understood then that somebody had not merely cut power. Somebody had reached out and taken light, comms, depth, and certainty. He kept the pistol leveled and waited, skin prickling under his collar, while the warehouse held its breath around him, and the unseen hunter closed the last of the distance. The dark worked for Elias the way operating lights used to. It stripped the room down to essentials. He focused on sound, weight, distance, and their mistakes. He came off the tree line low and quiet, cut around the side of the warehouse, and found the blind strip between the sagging wall and a stack of frozen pallets buried in drift. Wind skimmed along the tin hard enough to sting exposed skin. Snow hissed over ice. The side door stood cracked open just enough to spill nothing. There was no light now, only a deeper black where the interior began. He slowed before the threshold and let his left hand drift over the tools clipped under his coat. The jammer still hummed in his pocket, the folding knife rested where it belonged, and the cold metal jaw of the bolt cutters hung against his thigh. He could smell old machine oil, rust, wet dog, and blood somewhere inside. One set of steps moved in the dark beyond the doorway, careful and close to the wall. It was not the patient one, but the restless one, which meant Rafe. Elias waited for the rhythm, counted it, and pictured the man from thermal and sounds he had made outside. The man was armed, alert, and irritated. Elias rolled his shoulders once and stepped into the blind lane. Rafe was 2 yards inside, quarter turned, pistol up toward open space where he thought trouble might come from. He never looked at the wall beside him. Elias came out of it fast and flat, wrapping one arm across the man's throat while the other locked behind the skull and dragged him backward into the blind strip before his feet had caught up with what was happening. He moved with no wasted motion, slipping his forearm under the chin while his biceps pressed one side and his radius bone the other, keeping his hips glued in and his chest sealing the back. The choke bit deep before Rafe got his first full grunt out. Elias felt the instant change in the body under his hands. He felt surprise first, followed by the blind, ugly strength of survival. Rafe slammed his heels down and found no leverage on the slick floor. One shoulder drove back into Elias's sternum. The hit was hard, but it was not enough. Elias shifted half a step, tightened the angle, and took the space away. Rafe's pistol hand jerked up, searching for a target he could not see. Elias trapped the wrist against the man's own ribs with a knee and kept crushing inward. Hot breath burst against his sleeve. Fingers clawed at his forearm, trying to make room where there wasn't any. Somewhere out front, a chain creaked under the suspended weight of the woman and the dog. Somewhere deeper in the room, Silas kept perfectly still. Elias could feel Rafe's pulse hammering against the inside of his arm, fast and stupid. Then the knife came back. It was not from a belt draw, but from the offhand, already half open, dragged in a desperate backward arc, with more panic than aim behind it. Elias saw only the brief silver smear of motion before the blade hooked the sleeve of his coat and bit through cloth, insulation, and skin. The pain arrived white-hot and narrow, a clean burn that flashed from forearm to shoulder. He smelled his own blood instantly and felt it push out under the cut in one fast sheet before the cold started taking it back. Rafe felt it too. Men always did. The body under Elias changed again, found a stupid hope, bucked harder, and almost tore free. Almost. Elias answered by shifting the choke 3 degrees tighter and dropping his weight through it. Not angry, not rushed, just exact. The cartilage in Rafe's throat compressed under the heavy pressure. The man's boots skidded uselessly on Tracton ice. His knife hand spasmed once more, lost strength, then fluttered open. Rafe's whole frame convulsed. The fight left the legs first, then the shoulders, and finally the fingers. The suppressed pistol slipped from his grip and hit the floor with a clatter. Elias held him a beat longer, counting without meaning to. When he finally eased the body down, Rafe folded with dead weight, boneless and heavy and still warm. Elias lowered him onto the concrete instead of letting him drop, creating less noise that way. Blood from his own arm ticked onto the floor in dark, wet spots that turned tacky almost at once. He crouched, found Rafe's radio by touch, and thumbed the channel open on purpose. Static washed low through the speaker, shredded and intermittent under the jammer's interference. Good, he let it breathe. He wanted whoever was out there to think the line had gone bad instead of gone silent. He pressed fingers to the cut in his forearm, measuring depth by feel. The edges were open and slick under his glove. The cut was 3 inches, maybe a shade more, with no arterial spray or pumping rhythm, just steady flow and heat loss. The cold was already turning the blood around, the wound sticky and gluey against his skin. He flexed his hand once, function held, and the pain was sharp but manageable. He looked at the dark doorway leading deeper into the warehouse and let the numbers settle where panic might have tried to live in another man. 3 inches long. Missed the artery. It was enough to cause hypothermia in 20 minutes. That bought him time, not comfort. He scooped up the fallen pistol, set it out of the traffic lane, and left the knife where it had dropped beside Rafe's hand. Inside the warehouse, the chain rang once more, and a dog made a wet, strangled sound. Elias rose, blood working down inside his sleeve, radio left open beside the corpse like bait, and moved toward that sound without another wasted thought. Elias slipped through the doorway and into the warehouse, as if the dark had made room for him on purpose. Outside had been knife-cold pine and storm ozone. Inside was wet rust, old oil, fierce sweat, dog breath, and the copper steam of fresh blood trying to stay warm in a room that wanted everything dead and stiff. He found the chain by sound before he found it by touch, followed the trembling line upward, and reached the release hardware bolted to the beam support. There was no shouting from deeper in the warehouse. Silas had either frozen into discipline or shifted to a better corner. Elias braced one boot on slick concrete and worked the latch with quick, precise movements. The chain let go in jerks. First, the woman dropped half a foot, body folding awkwardly as the weight came off her throat. Then the dog. Titan hit harder. Harper landed on one shoulder and rolled, coughing against a crushed airway. The Malinois struck the floor in a scramble of claws and chain, legs kicking under him, chest heaving in ugly bursts that never quite became full breaths. Elias caught the loose links before they could slap the ground too loud, laid them down, and moved in fast. He checked the airway first, then watched whichever body decided to kill him for trying to help. Titan made that decision before Harper did. The dog came off the floor like pain had lit a fuse under him. Eyes white-rimmed, neck fur clotted down with blood and meltwater. Chain marks burned deep into the flesh beneath the coat. Elias got one hand under the collar line to keep the airway from collapsing further, and the other around the muzzle just too late. Teeth closed over his already cut forearm and drove down through cloth into the same torn flesh. The pain was bright and mean and immediate. He didn't yank away, because that was how you lost meat. He drove forward instead, taking space, folding the dog sideways, shoulder over rib cage, forearm across the back of the neck, weight low and absolute. Titan thrashed under him, hind legs scraping for purchase on black ice tracked across the concrete, jaws still trying to work deeper. Elias pressed harder until the dog's body had nowhere left to go but into the floor. He offered no soft words and no fake calm. He shoved the blood-slick sleeve under the Malinois' nose and held it there with the pressure of his whole body. Rafe's blood had soaked into his coat when he had made the kill. His own fresh blood sat hotter on top of it, establishing predator scent and pack order. Titan's growl broke, came back weaker, then broke again. The body underneath him changed by degrees. The dog was still violent, but no longer certain. Elias kept the pressure steady until the dog stopped fighting the weight and started listening to it. Only then did he let himself breathe properly. He slid 2 fingers under Titan's jaw, felt the frantic hammer of blood there, then checked the throat. He noted compression trauma, seeing it was not crushed through but close enough to matter, with swelling already starting and the airway compromised but not gone. He cut the last loop of chain free, eased the collar space open, and turned the dog just enough to keep the neck straight. Harper was on her hands and knees a few feet away, dragging breath through a throat that sounded flayed raw. She tried to rise, failed, and one hand moved instantly toward the side of her boot instead of her neck. She had her priorities straight, which was good. She was still thinking like a cop, not a victim. Elias shifted back onto one knee and reached inside the medical pouch at his belt. The stapler came out cold and blocky in his hand, ugly as an industrial tool. He peeled the shredded sleeve away from his forearm, thumbed the wound open enough to read the line, and set the metal mouth against his skin. The first click punched through the room, heavy and mechanical, and wrong enough to make Harper flinch. He didn't. The second click bit deeper. The third sealed the worst of it. Blood welled around the staples, thick and dark, but the edges held. It was better, not fixed, but it just bought time. He rolled his wrist, tested his grip, then went back to Harper before her body could decide to quit on her. Her pupils answered the flashlight sweep, not equal at first glance, then close enough when she blinked through tears brought on by pressure and cold. He checked her breathing by feel more than sound, keeping a hand on her sternum and counting the staggered rise and fall. Her breaths were fast, shallow, and alive. He knew she would face thermal shock if she stayed on the concrete much longer. He cut the remaining links from around her upper body and dragged a torn moving blanket under her shoulders to get flesh off the frozen floor. All the while, Titan watched him from where he lay, sides pumping, lips peeled back enough to show red gums and yellow teeth, but the fight in him had changed shape. It wasn't trust, but recognition, maybe. Harper coughed wetly, blinked hard, and the very first clear movement she made was to slide her hand down to the heel of her tactical boot and press there as if counting her own bones. Elias saw that too. The blood smell hung thick around them, hot copper rising into air so cold it felt almost visible. Titan lowered his head by half an inch. Harper kept her palm on the boot. Elias tucked the stapler away, listened for movement in the dark where Silas had vanished, and understood that whatever had brought cartel men into his warehouse had not left with the man bleeding out by the wall. Harper came back in fragments. She felt the cold first, then the taste of iron and old dust at the back of her throat. The world swam in and out under a ceiling she couldn't make sense of. Beams crossing over rust, black, dark, while the storm thudded against the roof, somewhere above like fists wrapped in snow. Her neck felt flayed, and every breath dragged over it like broken glass. She knew she was on the floor because the cold had seeped through her uniform and nested in the joints of her spine. She knew she wasn't dead because dead men didn't cough this hard. Training tried to assemble the room from what little it had. She identified the warehouse, the hanging point overhead, one hostile down, another missing, her sidearm gone, and wondered where Titan was. She rolled, found him by sound, and saw only the shape of him a few feet away, watching the dark with his head low and his body wound tight. He was alive. Then she saw the man kneeling between them, with a bloody sleeve, a worn Carhartt, and a medical pouch open, moving with the calm of somebody who had already decided what every body in the room was worth. That calm scared her more than yelling would have. Her hand found the floor, then the edge of something cold and metal near the wall. It was a suppressed pistol, likely Rafe's, unless the stranger had dropped it there on purpose. She didn't stop to think about that long enough to save herself from it. Instinct moved before reason. She lunged, snatched the gun, thumbed it toward Line with hands that shook harder than she wanted, and brought the muzzle up on the man's face. The metal bit freezing cold into her palm, slick with condensation and whatever blood had gotten on it in the dark. "Don't move," she tried to say, but her voice came out torn and low, barely enough to count as speech. Titan shifted at the movement, ears up, uncertain which one of them was now the threat. The man didn't freeze and didn't flinch. He just turned his head and looked at the muzzle the way a medic looked at a fever chart he didn't trust. Harper saw everything wrong with him in one brutal second. The fresh staples pinning his forearm shut, blood drying black along the sleeve seam, the absence of panic, the way his eyes had already marked the angle of her wrist, her collapsed shoulder, and the lag in her reaction time. She had seen men like that overseas. They were not cops and not deputies, but men with skill sets nobody admitted existed until they were standing 6 feet away in a room full of bodies. Then he moved. One hand slapped the pistol offline before she could tighten her finger. The other closed over her wrist and turned it outward with surgical precision, not enough to break, but enough to strip all strength from the joint at once. Pain shot clean to the elbow. Harper lost the gun before she could curse. He took it from her in one fluid motion, thumbed the safety on by feel, and flung it across the warehouse. It skidded and struck metal somewhere in the dark, a long, useless scrape ending far enough away to matter. He still had her wrist when she tried to pull back. He twisted once more, controlled and ruthless, and her knees hit the floor. The room pitched. Titan gave one warning growl, deep and unstable, but stayed where he was. The man leaned close enough that she could smell blood, cold air, and the acrid tang from the stapler wound on his arm. His voice came low and flat, not loud, because it didn't need volume to carry weight. I am not a cop and not Cartel. I'm the only one keeping you out of thermal shock. Shut your mouth and breathe. He spoke in simple terms. Her body betrayed her by trying to obey. She took a breath in, slow, and a breath out, slow. He let go only after he felt the rhythm change in her breathing. He wanted control, not trust, and that was what he was after. Harper sat back on one hip and fought the urge to lunge again. It was a bad room for pride. One cleaner lay dead by the wall, while another remained missing in the dark. Her K9 was half crushed and staring at the stranger as if rank had just been reassigned by violence. There was blood on the floor and blood on his sleeve. She swallowed and felt the bruised throat punish her for it. The man's eyes dipped once to her boots. It was a small movement. He had seen it earlier when she hit the floor. He knew something mattered there, and so did the men who had hanged her up. That finished the argument. She reached down, fingers clumsy from cold, and pulled the small blade from the hidden seam at her ankle. He was ready, but he was not stopping her, his posture changing by less than an inch. Harper jammed the edge into the damaged heel splint and cut hard along the inner seam. Plastic cracked and adhesive gave. A black sliver, wrapped in weatherproof polymer, slid into her palm. She held it up between them, breath shivering through her chest. They didn't come for me. They came for this, the mayor's payroll. Saying it out loud changed the room. The stranger looked at the drive, then at the dead man by the wall, then toward the dark, where the other one had gone. He showed no surprise, only cold and fast recalculation. Titan's nose lifted, catching the shift in both of them. Harper closed her fingers around the drive until the edges hurt and understood, with a clarity she didn't want, that survival had just become the smaller problem. The drive sat black and small in Harper's palm, too light for the damage tied to it. Elias looked at it, then at Titan's bruised throat and the blood tack drying on his own sleeve. The warehouse had gone quiet in that dangerous way bad places sometimes did after the first burst of violence, as if the whole building were listening. Wind struck the rusted walls in heavy pulses. Each hit sent a fine shiver through the tin. Harper's breathing still rasped through bruised tissue. Titan lay low on the concrete, head up, eyes moving between Elias and the dark where Silas had vanished. The dog no longer looked half dead, but looked like a weapon trying to remember its job. Elias stepped toward the side door, stopped, and tilted his head. Static whispered from the radio beside Rafe's corpse, shredded under the lingering interference from the jammer. Good. The line was still sick, and sick lines made men sloppy. He crouched, 2 fingers brushing the volume wheel lower, and that was when the static broke apart around human noise. He heard a breath first, wet and ragged, then another tighter pull through a chest that had been running hard in the cold. The radio static broke once, and Silas came through in fragments, his voice flattened by cheap circuitry and distance. There was no conversation and no pleas for backup, just a man reading a number off the edge of a knife. "Code red," he said, breath hitching after it. A second later it came again, harder this time, each syllable bitten off like he was trying to force the message through weather, blood, and fear by sheer contempt. Then the channel filled with movement. A door slamming somewhere outside, boots on crusted snow, the static hiss of a transmitter changing hands. Elias didn't need the rest. The phrase had already done its work. Harper heard it too. He saw the understanding hit her face before she hit it. She showed recognition, not shock. Whatever had sold her out inside the department had procedure behind it. Procedure meant escalation ladders, and procedure meant men standing by with engines warm. Elias killed the jammer, and the static cleared just enough for a final burst of noise to make it through. With Silas breathing hard into the mic, someone on the far end answering once, clipped and professional, then the line going dead, for real. That was worse than shouting would have been. Shouting belonged to panic, but calm acknowledgement meant systems. Elias rose and crossed to the warped wall, using the gap between sheets of tin as a slit window. The storm outside had thickened, turning the world into smeared white and black bands. But sound traveled better than sight on nights like this. He heard the first long shriek of tires finding black ice before he saw light. It started far off, just a thread slipping in from the county road beyond the pines. Then the thread thickened. He heard one engine, then 3 heavy V8 blocks, tuned low and coming in fast enough to make the noise stack on itself. Tires bit, slipped, bit again, each correction sending a blade of rubber scream across the frozen dark. Headlights punched through the tree line in broken flashes, hit the blowing snow, vanished, and came back brighter. Then the beams found the warehouse, and the whole building changed shape. White bars of light knifed through every crack in the tin, slashing across the interior in hard geometry, cutting Harper's face, tightened shoulders, the corpse by the wall, and Elias's boots. The walls trembled, with the pressure wave of 3 trucks dropping off the road and angling into the yard. Snow fountained up around the windows in pale sheets, and metal groaned. Harper flinched at the sudden wash of light. Titan rose onto his elbows with a rumble in his chest. Elias stayed still and counted. He counted 3 vehicles and 6 guns, probably compact rifles or SMGs, if Silas's people were still following noise rules. The yard outside was now a lit kill box. Any run for the trees ended with silhouettes and headlights, and clean shots. The first truck door opened with a heavy thump, then another, then 4 more in quick succession. Men got out and spread. Elias could hear the crunch pattern through the floor as clearly as if he were tracking vitals through a monitor. He noted their weight, spacing, and discipline, realizing they were paid cleaners and not just thugs. He mapped them fast. 2 covered the front line, 2 peeled wide, and 2 held rear pressure near the vehicles in case anything bolted. He knew they had under 2 minutes before they breached, less if Silas had already pointed them at the side entrance. He glanced around the warehouse and started building new kill zones over the old ones. Headlights through the seams had ruined some shadows and created others. Water from tracked-in snow had spread in long, shallow patches over the concrete. He spotted a hanging cable near the rear support that had half its insulation burned off. An old loudspeaker horn bolted high on a beam, Harper's police radio, and Titan, who was breathing rough but no longer finished. He could not hand Harper over. Not now. Silas had heard the drive confirmed. The cleaner team would burn everyone in the building, then clean the blood with the same dull professionalism as the men who had started the night. Elias felt the narrowing of options and accepted it without drama. There was no retreat left, only shape and timing. He bent toward Harper, voice low enough to live inside the engine noise. "Under 2 minutes?" he said. "If they get a clean entry, we die in here." Then he turned toward the shadows, the hanging cable, and the speaker horn, and began moving with the speed of a man who had chosen the only ugly plan left. The front doors hit the stops hard enough to shake rust flakes, loose from the frame. Cold air poured in, with 6 dark shapes cutting through the threshold. Rifles up, suppressors matte under mounted lights. Red laser lines skated over walls, chains, beams, and bodies in quick, precise arcs. The headlight wash from the SUVs behind them turned the blowing snow outside into a white curtain and threw the men inside as shifting silhouettes against it. One peeled left, one peeled right, two held center, and the last pair stayed half a step back, covering angles and the doorway with trained patience. Their boots cracked through, tracked in ice, and sloshed in meltwater, spreading thin over the floor. No one spoke at first. They touched Rafe's body, landed on the dangling chain, and moved on. Elias lay flat behind a dead generator housing near the rear support, one hand on the stripped cable he had yanked loose from a sagging conduit, the copper bright where he had skinned it open with his knife. Harper crouched behind a tipped feed bin, her police radio gutted open in her lap, wires pinched between numb fingers. Titan lay between them in a low, shivering coil, ears forward, teeth bare, but quiet. Harper's hands shook once. She steadied them by pressing both wrists against the side of the radio and stripping one more lead with her thumbnail. Elias had dragged the old loudspeaker wire down from the beam mount and fed it to her a minute earlier. She twisted the bare copper together, winced as her raw throat caught on a swallow, then touched the transmit contact with the edge of the blade. The loudspeaker above the cleaners popped alive in a burst of static, so sudden that all 6 laser beams jolted upward at once. Good. Their shoulders tightened with it. Harper kept her voice low for the first word, testing the line, then flattened it into something colder and cleaner than her own. It was a dispatch cadence. She showed no hesitation and left no room for doubt. All SWAT units, target at Warehouse 4, shoot on sight. The old horn distorted the edges, giving her just enough electronic grain to sell authority. One cleaner took an involuntary step backward. Another swung his rifle toward the door, suddenly more worried about what might be outside than what had already killed men inside. But the rhythm was gone now. Entry confidence had split in half. Elias saw it happen in their feet first, as weight shifted wrong, and muzzles no longer tracked a plan, just fear. That was the moment he had been waiting for. Panic by itself made noise, but panic plus uncertainty made openings. Elias crawled 2 feet to his left, keeping low, and fed the stripped end of the cable through his glove until he could feel the bare wire bite. Ahead of him, meltwater had pooled in a shallow ribbon where the warped roof had been dripping for hours. 2 of the cleaners were standing in it without knowing. A third was 1 step away. Headlights kept blasting through the doorway and side seams, turning every moving shadow into a possible target. Harper keyed the speaker again, shorter this time, breathing blood taste between words. Perimeter locked, no exits. One cleaner pivoted toward the side wall, his laser streaking red over his partner's chest. In the confusion, Titan rose soundlessly to a crouch. Elias gave him no command, because the dog was reading the room now. Elias drew the cable back once, felt the tension in it, then whipped his arm forward. The stripped copper landed in the meltwater with a wet slap and a hiss so soft it almost disappeared under the engines outside. Elias pressed himself flat against the floor, feeling the violent hum of electricity vibrate through the concrete beneath his chest. For one razor-thin instant, nothing happened. Then the current found the path it wanted. The floor erupted in white-blue light. It was not an explosion, not exactly, but more like the room had bitten its own tongue and spat lightning. The water sheet flashed alive under the cleaner's boots. Arcs jumped ankle to ankle, up steel shelving, across the fallen chain links, turning every wet surface into a strobing attack. One man screamed, another fired by reflex. The suppressed burst still loud inside the metal shell of the warehouse, rounds stitching sparks across a support beam and striking the man beside him. Retinas went blind in pulses. Lasers whipped wild. Someone stumbled backward, half-blinded, and emptied a burst toward the red line cutting across his own vision. Only the red line belonged to his partner. That man folded sideways into the doorframe. Titan launched at the third one low and black and fast, hit the gun arm, and dragged it off target with a snarl that echoed over the gunfire. More shots broke loose. Ragged now, the flashes from the electrical arc kept hitting in savage intervals, burning the room into snapshots, showing a cleaner clawing at his headset, another firing into smoke and steam, and another falling on his own brass as the slick water and black ice betrayed his feet. The smell came a beat later, harsh and unmistakable, ozone and burned insulation layered over hot copper blood. Elias stayed down through the first blind volley, counting 2 men already out, 3 shooting wild, and 1 struggling with Titan. In the strobing light, the warehouse belonged to confusion, current, and the 2 survivors, hidden in its bones. The strobe kept cutting the warehouse into pieces. There was a white-blue flash, then black, then a white-blue flash again. In one frame, a man stood with his rifle half raised. In the next, he was on one knee, both hands flying to the back of his leg, where Elias had just swept the man's leg out with a precise, hard strike. There was no wasted motion. Elias moved between pulses of light, using the blind gaps the electrical arc gave him. His boots found the seams in the concrete and the slick patches of tracked in meltwater without thought. A cleaner swung toward him too late, muzzle dragging behind Panic, and Elias stepped inside the rifle line and slammed the heel of his hand under the man's jaw, sending him crashing backward to the floor. The impact dropped him instantly. No music played, and there was no shouting that mattered, just breath, the spit hiss of current and water, and the ugly sounds men made when pain stripped rank off them. Elias stayed low, shoulders forward, vision narrowing and widening with each flash. A burst of suppressed fire stitched through the dark above his head and chewed sparks from a steel shelf. Elias pivoted toward the muzzle flash and cut another man down at the base before the shooter could correct. The leg gave, the body folded, and the rifle went wild into the rafters. Elias stripped the weapon away, reversed it, and drove the stock across the man's face with a flat swing. The man cried out in shock before Elias disarmed him and struck him hard with the pistol grip. Titan hit the third one at nearly the same moment, a black blur in the strobing light. The Malinois locked on the man's gun hand and tore downward. He fired into the floor blindly. Elias crossed the gap, planted one boot against the man's shoulder, and ripped the weapon free, while Titan held the bite. Another cleaner stumbled through the doorway smoke, trying to reacquire command, and Elias stepped into him from the side and struck him with the pistol grip. The man spun off balance, slipped on wet concrete, and crashed into the frame, where his own teammate's body was already hung up. He counted 3 down, 2 blind, and 1 moving clean. That left the clean one. Besides Silas, he was the only threat still tracking. Elias found him by the discipline in the footwork. The man was better trained and not panicked yet. He tracked a laser across the dark, searching for a shape that moved like a human. Elias did not move like one. He came from below the beam, struck the inside of the knee to collapse his stance, then rose with the same motion and drove the butt of the pistol into the man's face, dropping him hard. By then, Silas had understood the room was dead. He was backing toward the side exit with the ugly calm of a man who knew panic never saved anyone but retreat might. He didn't waste bullets, and he didn't bark orders. He moved in short steps, shoulders tucked, pistol tight to his chest. Elias saw him in slices between flashes. He tracked the black jacket and the controlled breath. Elias moved parallel through the dark, never crossing the beams, keeping shelving and hanging chains between them until the exit narrowed. Silas reached the door and turned just enough to clear it. Elias stepped out of the blind strip and hit him from behind before he could take the last half step into the snow. Silas's jaw clenched as the impact threw him forward. One arm folded across Silas's throat. The other brought the medical tourniquet around from Elias's belt in a single practiced motion, webbing already looped, windlass cold and slick in his grip. Silas tried to twist. drove an elbow back into Elias's ribs, and nearly bought himself an inch. Elias took the inch back and cinched the strap high across the carotids. He targeted the blood flow, not the airway. Silas understood immediately. His hands flew to the strap, fingers jamming under it, pistol dropping uselessly into the snow-packed threshold. Silas's eyes widened in sudden, stark realization as he fought the unyielding grip. Elias planted his boots, one inside on wet concrete, one outside on ice, and started turning the windlass. The first second changed Silas's breathing. The second took his balance. By the third, his heels were scraping grooves into the slush while his pulse slammed against the pressure crushing both sides of his neck. Elias felt his own forearm wound reopen under the strain. Warm blood slid under the Carhartt sleeve and spread sticky heat across his skin before the cold locked it down. Good. Pain meant he was still measuring right. Silas clawed at the tourniquet, elbows jerking. 4 seconds passed, then 5, and the hands weakened. By 6, his knees dipped, and his weight sagged backward into Elias's chest. Titan stood a few feet away in the strobing dark, muzzle painted red-black with someone else's blood, watching without a sound. At 7 and 8, Silas's boots kicked once against the threshold, and then missed it entirely. By 9, the body was still alive, but the man had already gone somewhere else. Elias kept the pressure on. He counted 10, then 11, as the wound in his arm pulsed through the torn sleeve and soaked into the cuff of the coat. At 12, Silas stopped being a problem. Elias held for one more silent count, then let the dead weight settle against him before easing it down onto the concrete and packed snow. The room behind them had gone almost still now, just the dying spit of the electrical arc and the hard breathing of whoever was left alive enough to hear it. Elias bent close, not for drama or justice, just to put words where they belonged. "You dirtied my snow." Then he stood up bleeding and looked back into the warehouse to make sure nothing inside it would ever stand up again. By the time the last shot echo died, the storm had eased from a full scream to a steady, grinding hiss. Snow still moved through the broken seams of the warehouse, but it no longer hit the walls hard enough to make the whole structure shudder. The place looked bigger now that the killing was over. It felt bigger, emptier, and worse. Bodies were down across the concrete in awkward, scattered shapes. Spent casings lay in the meltwater and in the blackened grit under the lights, brass dulling fast in the cold. Elias moved through them one by one, not hurried, not relaxed, just precise. He crouched to pick up each casing between fingers gone stiff from cold and blood loss, dropping them into a canvas pouch at his belt with soft metallic taps. The concrete bit through the knees of his jeans every time he lowered himself. His reopened arm had started to throb under the stapled cut, each pulse a flat reminder that the body kept score. Harper sat against a support post, wrapped in the torn blanket. One hand closed around the drive inside her pocket, watching him with hollow focus. Titan moved after Elias in a loose, quiet arc, favoring the side of his throat but staying on his feet. Elias found a half-full bleach bottle in a dented utility crate near the back wall and twisted the cap loose with his good hand. The smell hit sharp enough to bite the inside of his nose, clean and ugly and chemical. He sprayed the first widening fan over a pooled smear where one of the cleaners had gone down near the generator. The liquid frothed pink for a second, then turned watery and pale as it spread through the blood. He worked methodically from one patch to the next, boots crunching over broken glass and grit, misting every place his own DNA or theirs might matter later. Bleach hissed softly when it landed on the still warm metal of a dropped suppressor. Steam lifted where it mixed with blood trapped in the grooves of the floor. The smell kept thickening until it sat over everything else, harsh enough to make Harper cough into her collar. Elias did not look at her. He had already dragged the dead clear of the doors, wiped the obvious contact points, and checked the tracks outside. Snow was taking care of the rest in slow white layers. At the doorway, he knelt again and plucked 2 more shell casings from slush gone pink at the edges. The brass felt rough and freezing in his fingertips. He dropped them into the pouch and rose with a grunt he didn't let turn into pain. Behind him, Titan came close for the first time without testing distance. The dog's nose touched the back of Elias's hand, then his wrist, then the blood dried along his jaw. A single rough lick crossed the salt, the iron, and the dirt. It was recognition, not affection. Harper finally found enough voice to use it. "Where are you going?" The question came scraped raw, with no gratitude in it, no softness, just a cop trying to see the edge of the map before she stepped over it. Elias capped the bleach and set it down. For a second, he looked at the warehouse the way a man might look at a house after a fire, not mourning it, just measuring what had been lost. 5 years of quiet had died in a few hours. He thought about the sensors buried in the trees, the fuel caches, the traps only he knew how to avoid, and the routes in and out that had stayed his because no one else had known where to look. Now cartel cleaners had come here, and 6 of them had not gone home. The organization behind them would not call that bad luck. They would call it a hole in the chain and come probing until the hole closed or swallowed somebody else. He slung the canvas pouch over one shoulder, then bent for the pack he had kept stashed behind a feed hopper since the first winter in Pine Hollow. He checked the magazine on the recovered pistol, slid it into place, and finally looked at Harper. "To clean up. Your backup is less than 3 minutes out. When they get here, tell them Silas acted alone. Tomorrow, your organization is going to realize a squad went missing. This perimeter isn't safe anymore." He offered no speech after that, just the next problem named aloud. He crossed to Titan and crouched long enough to run a hand once along the dog's shoulder and check the swelling at the throat. The swelling was still bad, but the breathing was open enough to move, which was good enough. Titan leaned into the touch for half a second, then straightened when Elias did. Harper pushed herself harder against the post, as if trying to rise, but the room swayed under her, and she stopped. She was being smart. Elias left the bleach bottle where it was, left 2 dead radios crushed under a boot heel, and left the warehouse to its stink of chemicals and cooling meat. At the threshold, he paused, only to listen. He heard no engines now, and no tires on the road, just wind, lighter than before, moving through the trees and over the roof in long, tired breaths. Far off, beneath the grind of the storm, the faint, high wail of county sirens finally bled into the valley. He stepped out into the snow, and the cold caught the sweat under his shirt like a blade. Titan followed without a leash, one black shape falling into place off his left side. Behind them, the warehouse glowed in slices from the abandoned headlights, bright enough to mark the ruin, not bright enough to save it. Harper remained inside, with the drive, the bodies, and the first clean look at what surviving him actually meant. Elias did not look back again. He walked past the edge of his old boundary and into the dark timber beyond, where the snow swallowed tracks fast, and the next hunt had already started.